On our anniversary, I saw my husband spike my drink, so I switched it with his sister's. On our 10th anniversary, I watched my husband slip something into my glass of champagne. He thought I hadn't returned from the restroom yet. I stood behind a curved pillar at Alder and Pine, just far enough to see him clearly, just close enough to catch the shimmer of what he was doing. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I switched our glasses. Only later did I realize I'd handed that poison to his sister, and somehow, that choice saved my life. My name is Beyonce Knowles. I'm 36. I run a boutique communications consultancy in New York, mostly brand rehab and executive crisis coaching. 10 years ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage to the kind of man who made you feel lucky just to be chosen. Carter Lewis was tall, elegant, with the kind of presence that drew people in without effort. He came from an old Long Island family, the type with summer houses in East Hampton and family crests embroidered on cocktail napkins. I came from Atlanta. My parents were school teachers. Everything I had, I built with my own hands. When I met Carter at a panel, I was moderating on public perception and financial leadership. He asked one sharp question during Q&A that caught me off guard. Afterward, he introduced himself. I remember how calmly he spoke, how his voice never rushed. "I like the way you handled doubt," he said. "It means you've practiced integrity." We talked for almost an hour. 3 months later, we moved in together. 8 months after that, we married at his family's estate in Wainscott. I wore a satin gown. His mother, Lorraine, wore a frown so tight it looked stitched into her jaw. Back then, I thought I'd found someone who saw me for who I really was. Not just the polished strategist on the cover of Forbes Women, but the girl who still made fried green tomatoes when she missed home. Carter listened to my dreams. He laughed at my jokes. He said all the right things about strong women and shared ambition. And for a while, I believed him. We built a life in the Upper West Side. He worked long hours at Madison Rothschild Capital. I signed bigger clients every year. Our dinner parties were flawless. The Christmas cards looked like catalog shoots. No one saw the slivers of control starting to slip in. Not even me. It started small. Carter suggested I cut back on travel because we needed to be more present with each other. Then he asked if I'd consider merging our accounts fully, just to make taxes cleaner. He didn't like how much I worked with public figures, said it was risky for our name. I laughed it off at first, until I realized he never offered to compromise. It was always me adjusting. Still, I rationalized it. That's what marriage was. Wasn't it? I just happened to be doing most of the giving. His younger sister, Selena, didn't help. She was 3 years younger than me, had worked in daytime television for a bit before settling into an undefined role managing special projects at their family foundation. She liked to compare me to Carter's ex, Gabrielle, a hedge fund heiress who'd once vacationed with the royal family. Gabrielle would have known how to dress for the Belmont Stakes, she told me once, not even bothering to lower her voice. But I let it go. I always let it go, until I couldn't anymore. The week of our 10th anniversary. Something shifted in Carter's demeanor. He was tense, distracted, snapping at the housekeeper for tiny things. He started checking his phone during dinner, said it was about a trade dispute in Singapore, but I caught a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize when he tilted the screen away too slowly. Madison. No last name, just a heart emoji and a timestamp at 11:41 p.m. When I asked who she was, he smiled and said I was reading into things. I told myself to trust him. That's what wives are supposed to do. Right trust, be patient, hold the household steady. On the night of our anniversary, he took me to Alder and Pine, one of those places with Michelin stars and soft jazz in the corners. He'd arranged for a private alcove, complete with his parents and Selena, who arrived late and overdressed. We ordered champagne. Carter insisted on the Euro 6 Blanc de Noir. He made a toast. He held my hand. And then I excused myself to the restroom, checked my reflection, adjusted the soft curl in my hair, and stepped out just in time to see him poison my drink. I stood still for several seconds, hidden behind that polished marble column, heart hammering in my chest while my brain raced to make sense of what I'd just seen. Carter's hand had moved with the kind of precision that didn't come from panic but from practice. He looked calm, collected, even affectionate as he swirled his finger around the rim of my glass. The movement casual, like he was testing the temperature. He had no idea I was watching. The only sound I could hear was the clinking of silverware and the soft hum of conversation in the restaurant. But inside me, something ruptured. I didn't run. I didn't make a scene. Instead, I adjusted the strap on my dress, exhaled slowly, and walked back to the table like nothing had happened. The moment Carter saw me return, his shoulders loosened, just slightly. He smiled the way he used to, touched my wrist lightly, and gestured to my champagne. "You didn't drink any while I was gone," he said, almost playful. "You know how long I've been saving that bottle." I smiled back. "I wanted to toast properly," I replied. The glass sat there, tainted and gleaming, catching the candlelight just like my wedding ring did. Selena was seated directly across from me, busy scrolling through her phone and ignoring the Dom Perignon altogether. She preferred bold reds, always had. I knew she barely touched the champagne unless someone made her. Carter turned to say something to his father. That's when I moved. I reached for the breadbasket, knocked over a spoon, and in one fluid motion, switched our flutes. Mine now sat in front of Selena. Mine was safe, untouched. For the next hour, I performed. I listened to Lorraine recount a story about a recent gala. I nodded along as Robert explained something about an art donation tax break. Selena eventually took a few sips of the champagne and gave a tiny, irritated sigh. "It's too cold," she said, then kept drinking anyway. Carter kept glancing at me, his expression unreadable, but his glass remained empty. He was waiting, watching. I ate a few bites of sea bass, asked about their upcoming trip to Madrid, and held my breath as I tracked every change in Selena's behavior. At first, it was nothing, a slight pause between sentences. Then her speech began to slow. She repeated herself, which wasn't like her, and leaned against the back of the chair in a way that lacked her usual posture. "I think I'm just tired," she murmured, rubbing her temples. "This week's been intense." Lorraine barely glanced at her. "Maybe skip dessert," she offered, but I saw Carter tense. His smile slipped for the first time that evening. His hand tightened around his fork. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Selena suddenly dropped her napkin and blinked hard at her plate. "Is it warm in here?" she asked, voice a little too loud. Tyler, her fiancé, reached over. "You okay?" She nodded too quickly. "Just champagne, I guess," she mumbled, except she'd only had half a glass. Carter reached for the wine bottle and poured her more, even though she hadn't asked. "Drink water," I said, a little too quickly. He looked up, eyes sharp. "You never finish your drinks," he said, almost like a joke. I smiled. "Steady now. I like to stay sharp." That night, as Selena began to lean into Tyler's shoulder and slur her words during a toast to the future, something inside me fractured, but not in a way that made me crumble. I had lived too long trying to mold myself into a wife worthy of Carter's world, always adjusting my tone, my appearance, my ambition. Now I saw it clearly. This wasn't about champagne or a misunderstanding. He had planned something final. And even as I sat at that table surrounded by white linens and soft jazz, I knew what I had to do, but I needed proof, and I needed to survive. You can spend years with someone and never really know the version of them they hide just behind the smile. Carter had been building something behind my back, and I hadn't seen it because I didn't want to. That realization was like ice water. I excused myself again, claiming a call from a client in Tokyo, and stepped into the hallway outside the restrooms. My hands were shaking as I opened my voice recorder app. I didn't know what I was planning exactly, but I knew I wasn't going to leave that restaurant without a thread to pull. I returned just in time to see Selena leaning over the table, confused and flushed, knocking her wine into Robert's lap. Her pupils were blown, her voice cracking. Tyler was calling her name now. Carter stood up halfway, then sat again. She just drank too fast. He said too quickly. Lorraine's expression shifted. I watched him carefully, waiting for the moment his mask might slip. And when it did, even just for a second, I saw what he really was. Selena's hand trembled as she reached for her water. Tyler leaned in to steady her. His face creased with concern, but she blinked like she couldn't process what was happening. "I feel weird," she whispered, her voice slurred and strangely distant, like it didn't belong in her mouth. The atmosphere around the table shifted. Even Lorraine sat up straighter, her expression cooling from disapproval to something that looked a lot like fear. Carter stood suddenly, knocking his chair back an inch, then caught himself and forced a smile. "She'll be fine," he said lightly. "Probably just dehydrated." I watched him closely. Every movement, every micro-expression. His hand twitched at his side. His mouth was tight, but he tried to soften it when Tyler asked if they should call someone. "She's had a long week." Carter said, "Let's not turn this into a scene." That word scene echoed in my mind. He didn't say emergency. He didn't say concern. He said scene, as if her collapsing in public would ruin his image more than her health would concern him. That's when I knew there was no misunderstanding here. This wasn't some accidental reaction or poor timing. Something was deeply wrong, and Carter was hiding it. I picked up my phone under the table, started recording audio, and placed it casually beside my bread plate. I wasn't thinking about court or headlines yet. I just knew I needed to protect myself, and I needed proof. Tyler stood and helped Selena up. She stumbled against him like her legs didn't belong to her body. "I think we need to take her to urgent care," he said. "She's burning up." Carter reached for her, but I stepped between them. "Let Tyler handle it," I said, my voice low but firm. Carter froze for a second too long before nodding, too quickly. As Tyler helped Selena toward the front of the restaurant, I followed at a short distance and pulled aside the sommelier. His name tag read, Raphael. I remembered him because he'd complimented my necklace when pouring the champagne. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "Is there a manager or someone in charge of security on site?" He looked alarmed, and I leaned in before he could ask questions. "It's urgent. I need to speak to someone about surveillance footage." Within minutes, I was speaking to one of the assistant managers and a man named Ben, who handled security. They brought me to a narrow back hallway lined with black and white monitors. I told them exactly what I'd seen. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I explained calmly that I believed my husband had put something into my drink, that I had switched glasses, and that the woman who drank it was now showing alarming symptoms. Ben narrowed his eyes at the screen. What table number I gave it to him. We rewound the footage. It took a few tries, but then I saw it. Carter leaned forward just after I left for the restroom. He glanced left and right, slid his hand into his pocket, and tilted something into the champagne. It dissolved instantly. Then he swirled it with his finger like he was checking the bubbles. I looked away. Ben didn't. His face darkened as he muttered something to the manager and picked up his radio. "We're calling this in," he said. "This is a felony." For a few seconds, my hands went numb. I'd known the truth already, but seeing it with my own eyes somehow broke through a layer of disbelief I hadn't realized I was still clinging to. Carter hadn't just tried to control me, isolate me, or manipulate me. He had crossed a line. He had tried to hurt me in a way I might not have survived. When I returned to the main dining area, the table was mostly empty. Tyler had taken Selena out to wait for an ambulance. Lorraine and Robert were gathering their things. Carter stood by the bar, speaking into his phone. I don't know what gave me away. Maybe it was the steadiness in my walk, or the absence of fear in my eyes. But when Carter looked at me, he faltered. He ended the call and started toward the exit. That was when 2 uniformed NYPD officers entered the restaurant, flanked by Ben from security. Everything that happened next unfolded in eerie silence. Carter tried to play it cool. He straightened his sleeves, put on his investment banker smile, and told the officers there must be some mistake. But when one of them said my name and asked to speak with me, the expression in his eyes changed. He looked at me like I had betrayed him, which was almost comical, considering what he had done. I stepped forward and said the words slowly, carefully, like I had practiced them in my mind 100 times. I saw him drug my drink. He meant it for me. I switched glasses with his sister. The reaction around us was immediate. Lorraine gasped and dropped her shawl. Robert looked like someone had drained all the blood from his face. Carter's jaw twitched, but he kept trying to smile, even as one of the officers reached for his wrist. They hadn't cuffed him yet. He wasn't under arrest, but he was being taken in for questioning. And I knew deep in my bones that this wasn't just about that glass of champagne. Something larger was about to surface, and I was no longer afraid of what I might find. That night, I didn't go back to our apartment. After hours at the precinct, giving my statement, reviewing security footage, answering the same careful questions from detectives who clearly suspected there was more beneath the surface, I knew I couldn't go home. I called Olivia, the only person I hadn't pushed out during my marriage. She answered on the second ring. No questions, just asked where I was. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the undertone of panic she was trying to suppress. 30 minutes later, I stood in her doorway holding a small clutch and nothing else. I hadn't even grabbed a coat. Olivia was the kind of friend who didn't need explanations to open her door. She didn't make me talk that night. She just made tea, handed me a blanket, and sat beside me on the couch while I stared into nothing for a full hour. At some point I said it out loud, maybe just to test the sound of the truth. He tried to drug me. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp or say she couldn't believe it. She just reached for my hand and held it tightly, like she knew this wasn't the first time something had gone wrong, only the first time I'd let it be seen. The next morning, Detective Lynn called. She sounded more serious than the night before, but there was something else in her voice too. Not sympathy, curiosity maybe, or the beginning of confirmation. She asked if I could come in again. They had more questions. "We've spoken to your sister-in-law," she said. "She's stable, but the toxicology confirms there was rohypnol in the champagne." A dangerous amount. I nodded even though she couldn't see me, and told her I'd come in after breakfast. Then I sat back on Olivia's couch and realized I hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. At the station, I gave a second statement. This time it included details I hadn't mentioned before. How I'd felt groggy after Carter made me cocktails at home. How I'd lost hours of memory after one dinner in Montauk. The time I woke up and found him deleting something from my laptop. Said it was a corrupted folder. I hadn't thought much of it then. I'd blamed stress, work, jet lag. Now, laid out like puzzle pieces, the pattern was undeniable. Detective Lynn listened quietly, taking notes, her face unreadable. When I finished, she slid a folder across the desk. "We executed a search warrant this morning," she said. "We need you to look through these." Inside were printed screenshots of emails, bank transfers, insurance policies. I scanned the pages slowly, not because I couldn't read, but because my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. 3 separate life insurance policies, all taken out over the past 18 months, all listing me as the insured, all with Carter as the sole beneficiary. The total value was over $5 million. I stared at the figures, then the signatures. My name had been forged, not once, but multiple times. When I looked up, Lynn was still watching me. We also found sedatives hidden in his home office. She said, "And records of offshore transfers. This wasn't spontaneous. He's been planning this." I should have felt vindicated, but the dominant feeling in my chest was shame. Shame that I had slept beside this man, that I had shared my hopes, my fears, my family, my name, that I had convinced myself his quiet possessiveness was just passion, that his controlling behavior was love, that isolation was attention. "There's more," Lynn said. "We're speaking with someone named Madison Hale. Does that name mean anything to you?" I shook my head slowly. Then she turned the screen on her laptop toward me. Dozens of messages, photos, hotel confirmations, conversations I wasn't meant to see. Madison was real. She was 28, worked in marketing at Carter's firm, and had been in a relationship with him for nearly 2 years. The messages weren't just romantic. They were detailed, chilling. They spoke of a new life, starting fresh in Portugal, buying a vineyard, getting away from the weight of the past. And then there it was, the line that made my stomach turn. "Once the insurance clears, we're free." She had replied with heart emojis. He'd written back, "Dinner this week is the last step. Then we disappear." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat back in the plastic chair and let the weight of the betrayal settle into my bones. There was something deeply grounding about facing the truth after so long in confusion. Painful, yes, but clean. The officers told me Carter had been taken into custody that morning. They had enough to hold him without bail while they built the rest of the case. Madison had been brought in for questioning. She had claimed she thought he was divorcing me, not planning something darker. The jury was still out on whether she was telling the truth. But in that moment, I didn't care. What mattered was that the mask had finally fallen, and the man behind it looked nothing like the one I had married. After I left the precinct that day, I didn't go back to Olivia's right away. I walked the city alone for almost 2 hours, weaving through the late afternoon crowds near Bryant Park, pretending I was just another woman finishing meetings, grabbing coffee, thinking about dinner plans. No one who passed me would have guessed I had just learned that my husband of 10 years had forged my signature on multiple life insurance policies, had transferred millions to offshore accounts, and had intended to erase me quietly with a glass of champagne. No one knew I was walking with copies of those policies in my purse, the weight of betrayal heavier than anything I'd ever carried. By the time I reached the corner of 6th and 44th, I felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that only shows up when you're completely done pretending. I sat down in a cafe, ordered nothing, and stared out the window for a long time before texting Detective Lynn. I asked if I could have access to the financial records from Carter's laptop. She said it would require a subpoena, but if I had a specific concern, I should voice it now. I told her I wanted to know if he'd tampered with my company accounts. I wasn't just Beyoncé the wife anymore. I was Beyoncé the strategist, the founder of Knowles & Cohn, the woman who had built her name from the ground up without Carter's help. And now I was fighting not just for myself, but for every inch of ground I had earned and nearly lost. 3 days later, I met with my attorney, Gwen Cho. She had been referred by one of Olivia's clients and came highly recommended for handling high-profile divorces, especially those involving coercion or abuse. Gwen was methodical and piercing. She didn't ask how I was doing. She asked what I wanted. And for the first time since all of this began, I said it out loud. I want the truth out. All of it. I want the court to see the real him. I want to be free. Gwen nodded once. Then we'll make sure your story is heard. But you need to prepare for the blowback. His family will fight. They'll protect their name. I already knew that. Carter's parents hadn't called since the night at the restaurant. I wasn't surprised. They'd always considered me acceptable, not equal. Lorraine once said I was refreshingly articulate, as though it shocked her that a woman raised by public school teachers could speak in complete sentences. I didn't expect their support now. What I didn't expect was the message from Selena. It arrived late at night. Just this, I know you didn't mean for it to be me. When you're ready, I'd like to talk. I stared at it for a long time before responding. Me too. The next day, I met her at the conservatory inside the Met. She looked different, paler. Yes, but not just from the hospital stay. There was something softer around the eyes, like the old armor she wore so effortlessly had cracked. She didn't waste time with small talk. He told me you were slipping, she said quietly, that you were unstable, that he was staying married to protect the company. I swallowed hard. And you believed him? She nodded slowly. I wanted to, because the alternative was that my brother was the kind of man who would do what he did. She looked away for a moment, then back at me. I'm sorry. Beyoncé, I don't know how to undo what I said or did before, but I do know this wasn't your fault, and I'm grateful you switched those glasses, even if it nearly cost me everything. I didn't cry, I just nodded. Sometimes the apology we need isn't elaborate. It just has to be real. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. By the time we left, something had shifted between us. Not friendship, not yet, but something that felt like a ceasefire, a recognition that the real enemy wasn't each other. It was the man who had played us both. Back at Gwen's office, the forensic accountant had finished their initial analysis. Carter hadn't just stolen from me. He'd stolen from clients too. He'd siphoned off investment funds under dummy entities, funneled through a shell company in the Caymans. There was more than enough for criminal fraud charges. And while it wasn't my responsibility to build the case, it was my story to tell. Gwen recommended a press strategy. I declined. This wasn't about headlines. It was about reclaiming the parts of me that Carter had tried to erase quietly, without witnesses. That weekend, I sat at Olivia's kitchen counter with my laptop and wrote out everything. Not just what had happened recently, but the quiet, systematic erasure that had unfolded over the past 10 years. The way he made me feel smaller with questions disguised as concern. The business dinners I skipped because he missed me too much. The clients I let go of because he said their reputations might stain our name. I wrote it all. And when I was done, I didn't feel broken. I felt ready. The next phase wasn't dramatic. It wasn't made of bold declarations or news cameras. It was made of paperwork, meetings, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of things Carter had tried to dismantle piece by piece. Gwen moved quickly. She filed for divorce citing attempted murder, financial fraud, and emotional coercion. That alone raised eyebrows in court. Cases like mine didn't come around often. Not with this much documentation, this much evidence, and a husband who was already in custody with multiple charges pending. But legal systems still move slowly, and I had to live every day inside that waiting. While the lawyers handled court filings and prosecutors worked through the mountains of financial records Carter had buried beneath shell corporations and encrypted folders, I focused on something else entirely: myself, my name, my company, my future. Knowles & Co. had survived the chaos only because I had insisted, from the beginning, that it be a separate legal entity. Carter hadn't been able to touch it without triggering alerts, though he'd certainly tried. There were emails where he'd subtly pressured my COO to share internal documents under the guise of cross-functional alignment. Fortunately, my team had always been loyal to me, not my last name. The first time I walked back into my own office after everything, my assistant Marla stood up and just said, finally. She didn't ask where I'd been or what had happened. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes told me she already knew enough to stay silent, and that silence was the most powerful show of respect I'd received in weeks. We had a brief all-hands meeting that morning. I didn't go into detail. I just said there had been a personal situation, that I was fine, and that we were moving forward. Then I handed out bonus envelopes to the 3 people who had held everything together in my absence. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the first stitch in sewing back the fabric of who I used to be. At night, I met with Gwen and Detective Lynn. We discussed strategy. Carter's legal team was already floating stories about stress, misunderstanding, a marriage in crisis. Their narrative was familiar. The devoted husband pushed to the brink by a cold, emotionally distant wife. I'd seen it before. I'd coached other women through it before. Now it was being aimed at me. The irony was bitter. Gwen reassured me that the evidence was solid. The digital trail alone could bury him. But we also needed something more human, something that showed intention. That came from Madison. 2 weeks after the restaurant, she turned over voice messages. Carter had been careless, cocky even. He had bragged about how easy it was to manipulate me, how I wanted to believe in loyalty more than truth. He described the insurance policies in chilling detail, said he had timed the dosage perfectly, and that I'd just fade out like a light at a gala. Madison claimed she didn't know he meant actual harm. Whether that was true didn't matter. Her recordings spoke for themselves, and they gave the district attorney leverage. With those files, Carter was facing not only attempted murder, but conspiracy, insurance fraud, and premeditated intent. Selena and I met again, this time at a quiet spot in Gramercy where no one knew either of us. She looked stronger. She had cut her hair, wore no makeup, and held herself like someone who had stepped out of a shadow. "You were right," she said without preamble. "He wasn't who I thought. Maybe he never was." I nodded. I wanted to believe I knew him too. Then she told me something that stayed with me. "He didn't just want you gone, Beyoncé. He wanted to erase the parts of you that made him feel small, the parts that shined too bright for him to control." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't look away. "I think he hated that you never needed him to be powerful." After that conversation, I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I started seeing myself as a witness, not just in a legal sense, but in the broader one. I had lived inside the machinery of subtle erasure, manipulation disguised as devotion, and violence dressed in charm. Now I was stepping outside it, not only for myself, but for every woman who had been told she was too strong, too sharp, too much. The day before the first pretrial hearing, I stood in front of my closet and packed the last box from our shared apartment. I didn't take much. A few photographs, a favorite coffee mug, the framed poem my father gave me when I started my business. Everything else could stay. The apartment had become a museum of lies. I didn't want to take the ghosts with me. When I closed that door for the final time, I felt no nostalgia, just relief. Not the kind that makes you weep, but the kind that fills your lungs with air you didn't realize you'd been missing. The first time I saw Carter in court, he was wearing a dark gray suit with no tie, flanked by two attorneys who looked like they'd been coached to soften him. His hair was still perfectly groomed, and his posture as confident as ever. But there was something hollow behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the realization that charm alone couldn't carry him through this. Maybe it was the weight of knowing the version of reality he had tried to sell about the devoted husband, the overworked wife. The broken marriage was unraveling thread by thread under fluorescent courtroom lights. He didn't look at me when I entered the room. I didn't expect him to. I sat beside Gwen at the front row of the gallery, my back straight, my face composed, wearing a navy suit I'd picked not for style, but for armor. Selena sat 2 rows behind me, with her hands folded in her lap, eyes forward, jaw tight. Olivia was there too, her presence quiet but grounding. As the hearing began, the prosecution laid out the charges: attempted murder, insurance fraud, identity forgery, financial conspiracy, and obstruction. Each count echoed through the courtroom with an eerie rhythm, each charge stacking like bricks around a version of the man I once trusted enough to marry. When the recordings Madison had submitted were played aloud, you could feel the oxygen shift. The courtroom didn't gasp, didn't react dramatically. It just went still. The words themselves were plain, but the intention behind them was damning. Carter's voice, clear and casual, discussing dosage and inheritance and timing like he was planning a long weekend. Gwen leaned toward me and whispered, "This isn't just evidence, it's character." She was right. These weren't mistakes. They were calculations, and they revealed a man who didn't just lose control. He wanted it, craved it, weaponized it when love no longer served his agenda. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rise immediately. I took a breath. Then I stood, stepped forward, and faced the bench. I wasn't expected to give a full testimony yet, just a statement for the record, but I spoke clearly, from memory, without notes. I told the court how it started, not with violence, but with suggestions. how Carter had planted doubts in small, careful ways, how he chipped away at my independence while convincing me it was about closeness. I told them how I changed because I wanted peace, because I wanted the marriage to work, because I thought love meant bending without breaking. Then I told them what I saw at Alder and Pine. I told them how I switched the glasses. I didn't cry. I didn't look at Carter. I didn't need to. The judge listened with a neutral face. The defense team didn't interrupt. When I finished, I walked back to my seat, knees steady, breath even. I knew I had done what I came to do, not to destroy him. That wasn't the point. I had come to make truth undeniable. After the hearing, the media attention surged. The case had too many hooks to ignore: finance, betrayal, attempted murder, old money, and a wife who turned the story around before it destroyed her. I declined all interviews. Gwen handled public statements. Selena gave one brief comment outside the courthouse, not as Carter's sister, but as someone who had unknowingly played a role in a near-deadly plan. Her voice didn't shake. "This case isn't about wealth or scandal," she said. "It's about control and the women who refused to be silent." I watched her on the live stream and realized something quietly powerful. We had both been used, and now we were both witnesses. In the weeks leading up to trial, I continued therapy with a quiet resolve. Dr. Samuels, my trauma psychologist, never pushed me to relive it all at once. She let the story unfold in its own rhythm. There were nights I couldn't sleep, and mornings I couldn't look in the mirror without hearing Carter's voice somewhere in the back of my mind, saying something I used to take as flattery but now heard as warning. "You're sharp," he once said, "too sharp, one day. You'll cut yourself." He'd laughed when he said it. I hadn't understood what it meant until now. But the truth was, I hadn't cut myself. I had cut the illusion, and what bled wasn't weakness. It was clarity. By the time the trial date was confirmed, I had already signed the final divorce decree. Carter contested nothing. He couldn't afford to. His lawyers were focused on minimizing prison time, not preserving a relationship that had collapsed into something unrecognizable. I had sold the apartment. I moved into a new space downtown, smaller but light-filled, with no shared memories, just clean walls and high ceilings and quiet mornings. I didn't decorate much. I didn't need to yet. The silence itself was design enough. The morning of Carter's sentencing, the city felt colder than it should have for early spring. I woke early, long before the alarm, and sat in silence on the edge of my bed. The windows were still dark, and the only sound was the low hum of traffic several stories below. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. What I felt, if I had to name it, was finality. Like I was walking toward the last page of a long chapter I never meant to write. The court hearing wasn't a trial in the usual sense. Carter had taken a plea deal in exchange for avoiding a drawn-out process, something his legal team thought would preserve what little remained of his reputation. But the charges were too serious, the evidence too overwhelming. He would still face significant prison time. The plea only spared him the embarrassment of a full-blown trial. It did not spare him the weight of consequences. Selena arrived at my apartment just after 7. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no makeup, just composure. We didn't talk much on the ride downtown. There was nothing left to rehash. We had both read every statement, heard every recording, seen every page of the financial reports. What mattered now wasn't what he'd done. It was that someone had finally said no. The courtroom was quiet when we entered. Olivia was already seated, along with Gwen and one of the DA's assistants. Carter was led in through the side entrance, flanked by officers. He looked smaller somehow, like the fabric of his presence had been ironed too many times and finally thinned. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. His posture was still stiff, still trying to perform dignity, but it no longer landed the way it used to. You can only sell the illusion of control so many times before even your silence sounds false. The judge was a woman in her 60s, sharp and steady, with a voice that cut through the air without needing to rise. She read through the summary of charges, then invited the victim statements. I had prepared 1 week in advance, edited it a dozen times, and almost didn't bring it that morning. But when she called my name, I stood and walked to the front of the courtroom with the copy folded carefully in my hand. I didn't read from the paper. I looked just over Carter's head and spoke as if I were narrating my own life to someone watching from the back of the room. I said that I had once loved a man who made me believe safety and silence were the same thing. I said that the slowest kind of damage is the kind that wears your boundaries down just enough that by the time something breaks, you're not even sure it's wrong anymore. I said that survival shouldn't come down to instinct at a restaurant table, but sometimes it does. And I said I was done carrying the shame of someone else's choices. I didn't cry. My voice didn't shake. I didn't ask the court for anything. I just told the truth and let it land where it needed to. Selena spoke next. Her voice was quieter, more brittle, but every word was steady. She described what it felt like to wake up in a hospital bed, not knowing how she got there. She said Carter hadn't just betrayed his marriage. He had betrayed their family, their name, and her trust in what they were taught to believe about loyalty. Her words didn't dramatize anything. They didn't need to. Truth has a shape that speaks for itself when given enough light. When the judge delivered her sentence, the room held its breath. 32 years, no parole before 25. The charges had stacked, and the recordings had sealed the outcome. Carter stood still as the cuffs clicked back around his wrists. He didn't protest. He didn't shout. But as the officers moved him toward the exit, he turned slightly toward me. His eyes met mine for less than a second. There was no anger there, no regret, just emptiness. A man watching the world he built fall apart and realizing too late it had never been real. After the courtroom cleared, I walked out into the sun for the first time in what felt like years. The light wasn't dramatic. It didn't warm me instantly. But it was there, clean, bright, indifferent, like the world had moved on without waiting for me to catch up, and I was finally ready to follow it. In the weeks following Carter's sentencing, the world didn't shift overnight. There were no movie endings, no dramatic montages of healing. What came instead was silence, not the kind that echoes with loneliness, but the kind that makes space. I moved through each day with a deliberate slowness, not because I was lost, but because I was finally allowed to choose my own pace. I stopped checking headlines. The initial media frenzy died down quickly once the court documents were sealed, and Gwen managed to keep my name out of most public summaries. I wasn't interested in legacy or revenge. I was interested in peace. I returned to work full-time at Knowles & Co. by early May. My team welcomed me not with fanfare, but with respect. The kind of quiet acknowledgement that said they understood the depth of what I'd been through without needing to name it. We launched 2 major campaigns that quarter. One was for a nonprofit focused on domestic financial abuse, a cause I had never publicly supported before, but now felt urgently personal. The second was a rebrand for a small skincare company run entirely by Black women founders. Both projects reminded me that strategy wasn't just about numbers and timing. It was about clarity, positioning, and narrative, the very things I had used to reclaim my own life. Selena reached out less often, but when she did, it was genuine. There was no attempt to rebuild the past. Instead, we met occasionally for coffee, talked about books, weather, or how strange it was to live without pretending. Her family, unsurprisingly, had fractured. Her parents moved to a different state shortly after the sentencing. She stayed behind, not to make a statement, but because she said starting over didn't always mean moving far. Sometimes it just meant refusing to carry certain people forward. Olivia visited often. She said it made her feel less like she had lost a friend and more like she had helped someone come home. She never asked for details, never tried to push. She just kept showing up, the same way she had when we were broke and building and believed the future was something we could plan in a notebook with bullet points and deadlines. She reminded me that not all history was painful. Some of it was just paused, waiting to be picked up again. One evening in late June, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and the city blinking quietly around me. I opened my laptop and found the old folder I'd started months ago, the one labeled Reframe. It was a half-built idea I hadn't touched since before Carter's arrest. Something that combined storytelling and strategic consulting for women-owned ventures at the time. I didn't have the capacity to lead it, but now it didn't feel ambitious. It felt necessary. I stayed up until almost 2 a.m., mapping out what it could look like, not for scale, not for acclaim, just for impact, for clarity, for women like me. In therapy, Dr. Samuels asked me once what forgiveness looked like to me. I told her I didn't know. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way people expected, but I didn't feel obligated to soften either. I didn't need to forgive Carter in order to move forward. I just needed to stop giving him space in my internal narrative. That, I realized, was its own form of closure, not rewriting the past, but refusing to let it shape the present. The last thing I did before closing that chapter completely was something no one else knew about. I visited the restaurant where it all started, Alder and Pine. It had reopened after renovations, new name, new chef, but the architecture was still the same. I sat at the exact table where I'd once switched the glasses. The staff didn't recognize me. No one stared. I ordered a simple meal and stayed long after the check was paid. I didn't come for symbolism. I came for stillness, to sit in the place where everything nearly ended and feel nothing but breath. As I left, I paused at the entrance and looked back, not with fear or sadness, but with quiet recognition. That woman who sat here months ago wasn't weak. She was surviving the only way she knew how. But the woman walking out tonight had rewritten the rules entirely. 6 months after Carter's sentencing, I stood on a small stage at a private women's leadership summit in Boston, speaking not as a survivor or a symbol, but simply as a strategist. The topic was legacy, not in the performative sense of what people say about you when you're gone, but in the structural sense of what systems you leave behind that no longer need your name to function. It was my first public appearance since everything, and I wasn't there to tell the whole story. I was there to talk about power, how it's built, how it's hidden, and how it's reclaimed. I didn't mention Carter. I didn't need to. The audience understood that clarity doesn't always come in the form of confrontation. Sometimes it's built from repetition, boundary by boundary, until your life no longer contains the parts that broke you. After the talk, A woman in her 40s approached me. She didn't give her full name, just said, "You reminded me it's not too late to start over." I smiled and said something polite, but the sentence stayed with me the entire flight home, not because it was flattering, but because it was true. Most people don't need a miracle. They need a model of survival that doesn't depend on revenge, rage, or noise. They need to know that coming back doesn't require making the world applaud. Sometimes it's as quiet as knowing your own voice when no one else is speaking. Reframe officially launched 2 months later. We started small, with just 4 clients and a team of 3. We didn't advertise. We didn't pitch. People came to us through word-of-mouth founders who had been shut out, voices that had been overlooked, stories that needed retelling without polish or pity. One of our early clients was a woman in her 50s who had built a tech company with her husband only to be pushed out during a merger. She didn't want justice. She wanted clarity, language, tools. I watched her rebuild not just a brand, but a sense of self. And I knew then that this work wasn't about healing others. It was about building the architecture that made healing possible. I stopped using the word closure in therapy. It didn't fit anymore. What happened wasn't a door that closed behind me. It was a door I chose to walk away from before it locked. Closure implies finality, but most healing is nonlinear. Sometimes the past knocks again, just to see if you'll answer. The difference now is that I don't open the door out of habit. I don't confuse silence with peace or loyalty with self-abandonment. I know what it looks like when someone smiles with their mouth and lies with their hands. I know what it feels like to mistake control for devotion. And I know how to leave before someone has to poison your drink to feel powerful again. My apartment now has more light than furniture. I like it that way. I don't collect much anymore, no souvenirs, no trophies, no frame press. What I keep are the letters from clients who found their footing again, the printouts of campaign results that made a difference, the photographs of my team smiling in conference rooms we once only dreamed about booking. I don't need reminders of what I survived. I need reminders of what I chose after survival. That's where the real story lives. Sometimes people ask if I'll ever tell the full version publicly, the whole story, the betrayal, the switch at the restaurant, the courtroom, the man who called me his wife while planning my absence. I tell them it's already been told in court records, in whispers among the industry, in the quiet shift that happens when people who once underestimated you start watching with curiosity instead of condescension. But more importantly, I tell them the most powerful stories aren't always the loudest. Some are told in how you lead after loss, in the dignity you reclaim, not because anyone gave it back to you, but because you realized it had never left. It had just been buried beneath someone else's narrative. I didn't win by fighting Carter. I won by refusing to let him become the plot line of my life. I stopped making room for people who only knew how to love conditionally. I stopped explaining myself to those who had already decided who I was. And I started building something that could hold not just my ambition, but my full humanity. If you're reading this, or watching this, or hearing this somewhere in your own life, if you've ever felt erased, silenced, manipulated, or made to question the reality you know in your bones, maybe the story isn't over. Maybe this is just the part where you stop surviving and start shaping, the part where you turn the page without asking for permission. So let me ask you something I once asked myself, quietly, while standing in front of a mirror that no longer reflected fear. What would your life look like if you stopped asking for room and started taking your place?